first webinar. It's great to see such interest in this topic, and we really have a fantastic panel to talk about this topic this evening, which is COP26. What are China's real intentions? The media has been full of interest in COP26, largely from an uncritical perspective. We have seen many commentators sort of ask, how can we go further and faster? But actually, these policies are carrying a threat to us in the West. China is speaking along with the rhetoric about climate change, but in some of its actions, like planning new coal power stations, for example, and in the way it's termed its climate targets in terms of emissions intensity, which actually encapsulates that objective to still continue growing into its climate policy. It's clearly pursuing a different approach from us in the West. So there's lots of issues there to break through. We will be doing that. I won't waste too much time with my introduction because we've got an hour and 15 minutes. I'm sure we're going to cover a lot of ground. Just some ground rules to begin. There's a chat function and then also a question and answer panel. So if you could submit your questions to the question and answer panel, I will only look at that section to answer questions from. Feel free to chat and talk among yourselves if you want to, but I will just be looking at the question and answer session, panel, for questions afterwards. So please do feed those in as you're listening to our speakers deliver their opening statements, and we'll return to those at the end for a sort of broad discussion about these questions that are raised. So without further ado, I'd like to go to our first panelist this evening, which is David Rose. David Rose is an award-winning investigative journalist who's had a long career looking at a number of issues, wide number of areas, including miscarriages of justice, human rights, the war on terror, and of course, the climate change debate. He's been with the Mail on Sunday for a long time, now with the Daily Mail. He's been a good friend to the GWPF for a number of years and now to Net Zero Watch. We're delighted to have him with us this evening. And he's also helped us expose conflicts of interests within the Committee on Climate Change and done an excellent job in getting to the bottom of a lot of those conflict of interest scandals. And he's written recently about China and COP26 and how Britain's climate change pledges will be viewed quite well in China as they see it as a strategic advantage. So David, I'm going to pass it over to you for your opening statement, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
As those of you in Britain will know, the last month or two, we've had the bizarre spectacle of a group that is a descendant of Extinction Rebellion, but is even more extreme, called Insulate Britain, holding up the traffic on many of London and other cities' biggest roads. Earlier this week, a man glued his face to a road in the city of London. Just an hour or two ago, I asked Insulate Britain's spokesperson, you say that we're in this extreme danger, that we're facing a catastrophe, and therefore you have to take these extreme actions, but why do you never mention China? And she said to me, well, we can't really do anything about China. And if you're in a lifeboat, and it's sinking, well, you just start bailing and hope others will join you, which does seem like a refreshingly naive way of putting it. The background, as I'm sure many of you watching will be well aware, is that China is now by far the world's largest emitter. Its emissions continue to grow at a fairly rapid pace. Faced with energy shortages in recent weeks, Xi Jinping's response has been to order the reopening of old coal mines that had fallen into disuse and the opening of new ones. And right now, China has more new coal-fired electricity generating capacity in its production pipeline than the entire UK generating capacity from all sources. China also surpassed the UK and the whole of the developed world, except the United States, in emissions per head some years ago. In the case of the UK, it was in 2014. To all intents and purposes, China is an advanced industrial economy, and its economic stranglehold only grows. And increasingly, because of its cheap energy, derived principally from coal, though also from other fossil fuels, and I do accept that China is invested in renewables too, but they do account for only a small proportion of its energy output. Largely due to that advantage, it has been stealing ever greater numbers of industrial jobs from Britain and other Western nations. Dieter Helm made this very clear in his book some years ago, published in 2012, The Carbon Crunch, and he talked about the futility of simply exporting consumption emissions to countries such as China, where production emissions remain very high. This, as he pointed out, did nothing to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and indeed, given that industrial manufactured items would now have to be shipped across the sea in large fossil fuel burning boats, they would actually add to emissions. But interestingly, this has now spread not only to, if you like, classic industrial production, but increasingly to green industries too. I went recently to Methyll in Scotland, where many of the largest oil and gas offshore platforms were manufactured, and this technology, building these big platforms on the seabed, able to withstand the great storms of the North Sea, was of course quite adaptable to wind turbine technology. And indeed, in the early years of the Scottish offshore wind boom, Methyll did very well. It got the contract to build the jackets, as these platforms are called, for the Beatrice offshore wind farm, which is one of the biggest off the coast of Britain. But currently, the place is almost deserted. There is tumbleweed, or there would be if there was tumbleweed in Scotland, blowing through the empty yard, this vast empty yard, now employing very few people. The principal activity there right now actually is breaking up an old gas platform for scrap, and almost nothing else is happening. They had been promised they would get the contract to build the 100+ jackets for what is currently the biggest offshore field being developed, known as NNG. Instead, they're being made in a yard in southern China by the Fluor Corporation. And this is a pattern that's increasingly being repeated. And we now see China having wiped out the solar panel industries of Germany and the United States through dumping some years ago. It's now doing the same to the wind industry. China's cheap coal-fired high-emitting energy is enabling it to steal green industrial jobs as well as ordinary industrial jobs. Now, I think at this point, the interesting thing, given its stance at the COP and what's likely to unfold, is asked, precisely the question that this meeting is posing. What is it doing here? What is its goal? What is its intention? And it seems to me that one can take a benign or a sinister intention, a sinister interpretation. And frankly, I find neither very encouraging. The benign interpretation is that which many Western green organizations adopt. They say, well, we're engaged with China. We're deeply involved in persuading them to invest in green development in the Belt and Road Initiative. We are in constant dialogue with them and helping them to improve the pollution situation in their cities. And we believe that slowly but surely we're enticing China to join the rest of the developed world in a green future. And yes, okay, they have said they will not actually start to decarbonize until 2030, or perhaps this will be their rabbit out of the hat next week, slightly before, and won't get to net zero until 2060. But nevertheless, their intentions are pure. Okay, so yes, it's true that this does continue to give them a huge industrial advantage while they continue to meet their strategic objectives and dig out more coal and indeed develop more oil fields. Xi also said last week, he visited one of the big China oil fields and talked about its great importance and said how China had to be energy independent. And he didn't mean energy independent by building wind farms, he meant by producing more oil. But so under that benign interpretation, fine, we give them a bit more of a head start. We let them increase their economic domination of the world, but in the end, they get there. The less encouraging, the more sinister interpretation, it seems to me, is that China is quite cynically manipulating the Western environmental movement and many of its politicians in order to achieve what it has openly stated to be its overarching strategic goal, namely to become the world's unchallenged superpower by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the communist revolution that brought Mao Zedong to power. Is that a realistic interpretation of its actions? Well, in the first place, we can see that when it does say it wants to move towards decarbonisation, clearly it has no altruistic intention. Its only intention is to maintain its own interests and indeed enlarge and cement its domination. But I think there are other more worrying things. One of the things that the many Western environmentalists who engage with China fail to see is that, in fact, when they join international organizations based in China, superficially or nominally devoted to greening China and greening its overseas interests through the Belt and Road Initiative, what they're actually doing is engaging with some of the most ruthless elements in the Chinese Communist Party. Take, for example, Xi Jinping. Now, Xi Jinping has been China's chief climate envoy for a number of years. He led its delegation at the Paris COP, and he will be doing so again at COP26 in Glasgow next week. Well, who is Xi Jinping? He is a party cadre of many decades standing, who was a senior member of the party's Central Discipline Commission until 2012. Well, what did that entail? It meant that he was one of those chiefly responsible for the brutal system known as shangui, which are the purges carried out of party members deemed to be ideologically deviant. And it is basically a network of secret torture centers where people are picked up, brutally tortured, forced to sign false confessions. And all this has been set out in a Human Rights Watch report, which covers exactly the period when Xi Jinping was a leading figure in that. Another thing to think about is that when these Western organizations join their Chinese counterparts, many of them speak of what is known as ecological civilization. Now, what is ecological civilization? It is now formally part of what is known as Xi Jinping thought for socialism with Chinese characteristics, what amounts to the Chinese Communist Party Catechism, its modern day equivalent of Mao's Little Red Book. In other words, it is a manual, a roadmap for achieving that goal of 2049 domination. Now, many of the Western Greens who've engaged with the people who are involved with this have just parroted its rhetoric, and they're involved. They actually use phrases like, you know, a green, beautiful planet, which are exactly the phrases that you will find in Xi Jinping thought. What they also fail to realize is that some of the people they're directly involved with are, again, representatives of some of the most ruthless parts of the Chinese Communist Party setup. For example, there is a think tank known as the CICR, which is essentially an arm of the Ministry of State Security, China's main intelligence agency. It is responsible for what is known as the Belt and Road Green Development Corporate Coalition big data platform. It's also responsible for the intense system of surveillance that you find on the Chinese internet and on its streets. And these are the people that Western environmentalists are dealing with. Now, Clive Hamilton and Marika Ohlberg, in their book Hidden Hand, which I urge everyone to read, lay out in great detail how the Chinese Communist Party uses these outreach organizations, many of them part of something called the United Front Work Department, to influence opinion formers, politicians, business people in the West and NGOs. Now, I suggest that I think this may well be happening with the Green Movement. In other words, they are being manipulated, not only to give China a free pass when everyone else is being urged to adopt, sorry, Boris Johnson, but the only phrase possible is hair shirt of the net zero goal, while China gets away with it. But is that sinister interpretation realistic? Is this part of an overarching strategic objective? And I think that is an important thing to throw out here for the debate. I'll end there, but I think that's a good context to maybe frame some of this discussion.
Thank you so much there, David. So many interesting points there that you mentioned, and I'd love to come right onto them, but we're going to go straight to our next speaker. He is Professor Gwythian Prins. I'm fortunate to be he's joining me here in London this evening. He's Professor Emeritus at the LSE, where he directed the Mackinder programme. He's a sort of classic old school academic, I think it's fair to say, who actually, starting off on his career, went to Africa and actually saw the development challenges that people were facing sort of on the front line, as it were. And then since then, he was at Cambridge for many years. And more recently, he's been a senior defence advisor to the government. He's a member of the board of the Charity Commission.
No longer.
No longer, but very recently.
My term.
And he's recently written a fantastic new paper for us called The Worm in the Rose. I've got a copy here. If you haven't read it already, there's a link to it on our website, so please do check that out. And it actually suggests at the end that a golden bridge strategy, which could potentially offer the way out of our current challenges and offer a China-proof path to a low emissions but economically successful future in the West. So we'll be asking him a bit more about that later, but first, why don't we go straight to him and he can give us his remarks.
Harry, thank you very much indeed, and good evening everybody and the other panelists. It's a great honour to be here, and indeed it was a great honour to write The Worm in the Rose, although I must say that I was somewhat dazed to find myself obliged to write such an essay. The reason I say that is something which David Rose has already alluded to, which is that there is a disconnect that is, in my now dreadfully long career, unprecedented between what's actually happening in the real world and what policy elites, particularly in the West, have persuaded themselves is happening in the real world. So what I set out to do with this publication was two things, really. The first part is devoted to examining from first principles the claims for so-called net zero and green growth, and pointing out some elementary fallacies which vitiate these ambitions. These fallacies are so fundamental that if they are indeed true, as I believe them to be in the evidence, then there really is no hope, no amount of blandishment, no wonderful analogies from our Prime Minister, no buckets of money from the Chancellor of the Exchequer are ever going to make real something which humanity has in its long history never ever done before, which is to have an energy transition which actually goes in reverse, because that is, in a single sentence, what is proposed by those seeking a goal of net zero. All energy transitions in history, the last 500 years, have moved. There have been many of them, and they have all moved in exactly the same direction. They've all moved from thin and intermittent sources of energy close to entropy to dense stocks, to coal, to gas, to oil, to uranium. And the idea that we're going to reverse this in a world where, as we sit this evening talking to each other across electrically powered devices, where we live and die by the power of fossil fuels, it's salutary to remind ourselves that ambitions in the transport sector, for example, to electrify or to, in inverted commas, decarbonize, which are so much the dominant theme of the moment, must be set against the reality, which is that well over 96% of all freight movements on the planet, by land and by sea, are diesel powered, and 99.98% of movements of aircraft are powered by turbofan jets. This is what's known in economic historical terms as lock-in, And that lock-in is not going to unlock, not in my lifetime, I think not in my children's lifetime either. Yet we are setting ourselves up this ambition. And as David has just reminded us, the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping is sedulously encouraging us to do just this. The effect of doing it, as I spell out in The Worm in the Rose, is effectively to encourage us to build towards weakness at a time when the PRC is building towards strength. And that strength is being built in the traditional way, just the way that we have done it during the last 300 years. That is to say, by ever more intense use of a full range of the most valuable low entropy fuels, that is to say, coal, oil, gas, preeminently coal in the case of China. And we are being encouraged not only to give up those fuels, but also the technologies which have given us control of world transport systems. Now, I'm not going to expand on that because I think that Professor Arima may well wish to do so. It is an extraordinarily powerful point in his extraordinarily powerful paper, which we'll be coming to in a minute. But what I want to do is to explain why I felt it necessary, having told that story from first principles, that green growth is effectively a Veblen good. In other words, it is conspicuous consumption. It is something which people wish to have because it is a virtue signal. That there is no green energy transition, that energy is not like other commodities, because if you break the energy system, you break everything. That energy efficiency will not bring net reductions, the famous Jevons paradox, which so many of the green economists seem to have forgotten or never known. The thought that renewables are clearly cheaper than fossil fuels because sunbeams and the wind are free, an elementary misunderstanding about where the costs of mobilizing thin flows of energy come from. Fundamentally, a belief that an arrogance that you can legislate around the laws of thermodynamics. The first two laws of thermodynamics can no more be repealed by Mr. Johnson or any other politician than King Canute could persuade the tides to obey his orders. And finally, that Britain has somehow offered the world a leading example of decarbonization, while all we have done is to offshore much of our carbon-intensive production, principally to the People's Republic of China. And so I come to that to underline the basic analysis which David has already begun to flesh out. China is a very, very old country. And let me say at once, I'm a historian, but I'm not a sinologist. That means that I pay careful attention to my colleagues who are. And from them, one learns two essential truths that seem to have run as a thread through Chinese politics for 3,000 years. The first is that all rulers have lived haunted by the same elemental fears. The first, a fear of social chaos, of implosion, of civil war, or of invasion by barbarians, which finds its physical expression and in many ways its psychic expression in the Chinese obsession with building walls, both metaphorical and literal. And secondly, the fear of any Chinese ruler that the mandate of heaven, when it moves remorselessly and quickly onwards. Now, as David has told us, we have in Xi Jinping a leader who has declared in an unusual way, compared to previous Chinese leaders, his open ambition of the China dream to make China the dominant world power by the centenary of the communist assumption of power on the mainland, and also a man with whom it appears that there is no real negotiation to be had. Where he is eccentric from his predecessors is in declaring this. Now, we in the West think that the glory that was Athens in the 5th century BC was ancient history. It was a very long time ago. contemporaneous with 5th century Athens was the era of the warring states in China. But for the Chinese, that is not ancient history. And from that era come the famous 36 stratagems, which are as useful today in decoding the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party as they have been at many times in the past. And the first of the 36 stratagems says that if you wish to cross the sea, you should deceive the sky. In other words, conceal your ambitions. And this is what all leaders up till Hu Jintao did. In this sense, Xi Jinping and his Politburo are eccentric. Where they are not eccentric, I would suggest, is that they still adopt the same oblique tactics, as David has pointed to. Their agency through the United Front Work Department as a powerful instrument to aid the subversion of the West and to make friends for China. It's one of their programs, to plant many Chinese, bright Chinese researchers through the 1,000 Talents program so that they can steal intellectual property. None of this is paranoid. All of this is well documented by well-qualified sinologists. So we need to understand, I think very clearly, that when you put together these, if you like, analytic points with the evidence on the ground, David has already reminded us, and others will perhaps come back to this, of the simple scale of the coal electricity capacity production that is in place in China today. They are about to commission more gigawattage of coal-fired power than exists currently in the United States in the next 40 years. They are about to double the number of internal combustion engines. They are about to double their oil imports from around the world. And they have shown their intent in this area during the pandemic year by signing 3 sets of extremely important Middle Eastern oil contracts with people who previously used to supply oil to us in the West, which includes, in this sense, the free world, including Japan. So we are engaged in a grey war. We are engaged in it at the moment. And what I think we need to explore much more clearly is what the implication of that grey war is for those of our leaders, which I'm sorry to say seem at the moment to include our Prime Minister, who are taking Chinese words at face value. Now here I surrender willingly to the greater expertise of Professor Arima, who after all has not only been absolutely central in the COP negotiations over many, many years, I've had the honor of supporting him on 1 or 2 occasions, but who of course is living quite literally with the dragon across the water. But what needs to be underlined in my final observation is a point which I often used to make to my Cambridge undergraduates, which is that conspiracy theories in history are to be consumed with discrimination. They're a little bit like Hershey bars or Mars bars as we have them here. That is to say, if you have 1 or 2, they're delicious. If you have a whole belly full, they'll give you a stomachache. But that doesn't mean to say that sometimes they're correct. And in this case, I think that it's not a covert conspiracy. It is there in front of our eyes to see how China is behaving. The China Dream philosophy is fully declared by Xi Jinping. His options to pursue it are patent. My final observation, though, is that a strategic one, a geostrategic one, which is that I would counsel that we do not regard China as being 10 feet tall. There are many in the strategic community with which I interact who believe that Xi Jinping has badly overplayed his hand. For there are many surrounding him in Beijing who will regard the awakening of the Five Eyes, things like the AUKUS nuclear submarine treaty that has just been signed, as signs that he has woken up the West, which was exactly what they didn't want to do. And so I think it's significant that he hasn't moved from China, let alone from Peking, in fact, for a very long time. Because remember, the mandate of heaven can move.
Thank you so much, Gwythian. Lots to ponder there again, but we're going to move straight ahead to our next panelist. So our next panelist is Patricia Adams. She's an economist and executive director of Probe International, a Toronto-based NGO, which has been involved in the Chinese environmental movement since the 1980s. She's testified before Congress and the Canadian Parliament, and she's also written a great report for the GWF called The Red and the Green, China's Useful Idiots. So again, if you haven't read that, I would strongly encourage that you do so. She's got a copy of it here as well. She has been a great friend to the Global Warming Policy Foundation and Net Zero Watch for a number of years. So we're so grateful to be speaking with you this evening, Patricia. And so without further ado, please take us away.
Thank you very much, Harry, and greetings to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I would say that the Chinese Communist Party has one overriding intention, and that is to stay in power. How do they do it? Well, they have to keep the lights on, they have to keep the heat on, they have to keep the factories humming, they need to stop the blackouts that have been occurring. They also need to keep the fighter jets and the aircraft carriers well supplied so that they can continue to intimidate and threaten neighbors. And for all of those tasks, they need fossil fuels, and they need them desperately. In fact, you could say that the security of the Chinese Communist Party depends on CO2 emissions. The higher, the better. The higher, the more secure they are. But they do have an intention, let me say, of reducing what I would call the killer poisons. These would be the NOx and the SOx, the particulates, the 2.5 particulate matter that comes out of smokestacks, comes out of tailpipes, because those can lead to civil unrest. Those are the really nasty pollutants that will lodge in the lungs of Chinese citizens and kill them. And the Chinese Communist Party knows that that is a threat. So they will do everything they can to reduce those. And they are attempting to reduce those. But when it comes to CO2, it is not an issue. It's not on the radar. It is not a public concern. It is of no concern to the Chinese Communist Party, at least domestically. So how are they going to do this? Well, the Chinese Communist Party has problems. First of all, they have a lot of coal, as we all know, and the speakers have listed the extraordinary expansion of not only coal plants, but coal-fired facilities. That is their safety blanket. It is their go-to source of energy. It is theirs. It is a source of their strength, and they will use it. Oil, they're in trouble. They have very few domestic supplies of oil. They're trying to tap their legacy fields without much success. So the effect of this is that they become more and more dependent on imports. Shale gas is there, but they are not able to innovate in order to get it out. The geology is different. It's a little more difficult than it was in North America. So far, they're producing a little bit more, but they have not been able to tap it as much as they would like. So that then leaves them with petrochemical facilities, and they are using those, developing those to convert coal into either gas or liquid fuels, mostly for use in the eastern urban centers where it burns more cleanly than coal does. And that meets their need in trying to reduce particulate matter, for example. The problem is, of course, when you convert coal into these other forms, to these petrochemicals, it produces twice as much CO2. So in their attempts to clean up the atmosphere so that they don't have civil unrest, they're increasing CO2 levels. It has always been a priority of the Chinese Communist Party to achieve energy security. And it is even more so now. The Super Planning Agency, NDRC, last year in its 2020 report highlighted this. Very little emphasis on CO2. They gave the sort of pro forma reference to it, but the priority was energy security. And we see it now. Now that they've got trouble with their energy supplies, and you've got the Premier Li coming out and saying, get fuel. He's saying this to the national state-owned enterprises and also the electricity generators, get this power at any cost. So the reason, of course, for this is national security. So this is really their main concern. So because they do not have their own domestic supplies of oil and gas, they have to go abroad. And they are. And they're going all over the world to secure oil supplies. Virtually every continent. They're going into the South China Sea. They're going to offshore oil wherever they can get it. The same is true for gas. They're going all over the world to secure gas supplies. So, for example, from Russia with the Power of Serbia, Siberia pipeline. And then they have what is considered the sort of jewel in the crown, which is the pipeline. It's an economic corridor that's going to travel from Pakistan up through into the areas of Xinjiang. And this helps explain, I think, one of the reasons why Xinjiang is so important to the Chinese government to be able to control it. It is becoming a very important conduit for supplies of oil and gas. So I think it's useful to keep in mind that the Chinese Communist Party is paranoid. They're paranoid about their own citizens, but they're paranoid about the world as well and about foreign interests. So we have a situation where they're extremely dependent on imported oil and gas. They need it, and yet they're dependent on foreign sources. And this is, of course, very, very worrying to them. One of the other concerns is that not only do they have to secure these supplies from other countries, and they're using the Belt and Road Initiative to help them do that, but they also need to convey these oil and gas supplies through 3 choke points. And that, of course, is very worrying to them as well. They go through the South China Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Strait of Malacca. So then what you see is the Chinese government building and arranging for port facilities around the world. They are in every continent. They have a long list of arrangements with different governments for port facilities. Many of these ports can be used either for civilian or military purposes. They also are using as much as they can overland routes to get this oil and gas. So you have a situation where they're in a vulnerable position with respect to access to oil and gas, and they need that oil and gas to stay in power. The second intention that I would say the Chinese Communist Party has is to be the world superpower, to replace the United States. And both David and Quinn have talked about this and have given a very good description of the intentions of Xi Jinping and the fact that he's now public about it. Whereas the old principles of Deng Xiaoping, which was to remain quiet, have seemed to have been abandoned. So in order to replace the United States as the world superpower, they need to continue deceiving the West into really a destruction of our own economy. In order for their economy to rise, they will do what they have to, but they're doing everything they can to undermine our economy. They're not going to reduce CO2 levels. Whatever they say at the COP26 or any of the COP meetings is simply public relations and designed to dupe us into thinking that they're going to take action. Why do they want to do this? Well, one of the reasons is they're very nervous about sanctions. They're nervous about sanctions over Hong Kong, over their human rights abuses. They're nervous about a possible move by Europe and other countries to put a carbon tax on on Chinese products going into their country. They want to stop that from happening. They need to be able to export to us. But mostly, I would say their goal is to get us to introduce net zero policies, which will undermine our own economies. And in that sense, they get us to do their work for them. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that without China buying in to the COP process and to the CO2 reduction promises, there is no campaign. As David has spoken about, and I addressed in my previous paper, the Chinese government uses NGOs, the environmental NGOs, to make their case for them, to get our governments, the home governments really, of the environmental NGOs to continue introducing net zero policies, which will meet this military and this sort of geostrategic goal that China has. It is important to remember that Xi Jinping has been very, very clear about it. His great rejuvenation, the China dream, made in China 2025. He's very clear that he wants to make China the supreme power. And although China's army and navy are now the largest in the world, he would very much prefer to win this war without firing a bullet. And this is, of course, one of the maxims of the very famous Chinese general Sun Tzu, and you can see it being played out today. He does not want to fire a bullet, and he's doing lots of things that will undermine us in favor of China. There's another very interesting maxim of General Sun Tzu's, which is that all warfare is based on deception. And we need to look at China's climate change policies and its net zero policies in this context. This is deception. They have no intention of reducing CO2. It is the source of their regime strength, and they will not reduce CO2 levels. So this is entirely deception, and they have their useful idiots, which are the environmental NGOs and many governments, who will make this case for them. It's very clear to me that President Xi's goal is to build up China and diminish the rest of the world. Sun Tzu also had another maxim, which is that the opportunity to secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, but the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. And that is exactly what we are doing. That, I think, is China's real intention at COP26. Our net zero policies really are a weapon for the enemy. And Xi Jinping wants to make sure that we deliver it to him.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Some important angles on there, I think, about the military aspects that might be involved, and also about China's vulnerabilities in terms of actually their access to fossil fuel resources, how important that access is, and how actually that represents a vulnerability to China as well. So I'm sure we'll come back to those themes very shortly. But first, we're going to go to our next guest, which is Professor Jun Arima. Now, he has a long experience in climate change diplomacy. He's been to many COP conferences with the Japanese delegation, and actually as well, he's been one of the chief negotiators for Japan at the UN COP negotiations. And famously at Cancun at COP16, he said that Japan wouldn't sign up to any version of Kyoto 2. And that was a really important moment within the whole climate change negotiations at the time. The situation has clearly developed since then, and we're looking forward to getting his insights on how things have changed. And he's also been a professor at the university. He's currently a professor at the University of Tokyo, and he's also worked here in London with the Japanese trade delegation supporting links between the UK and Japan, which I'm sure all of us here in the UK are very grateful for that relationship between our countries that he has helped to develop. So we thank him for that. And I will pass over to him now to complete his remarks.
Thank you, Harry, and good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to join in this webinar. And as introduced as a former negotiator, I was a negotiator of Japanese government for climate regime. And I'm currently increasingly frustrated with emerging eco-fundamentalism in the EU and the US, and even Japan, and which will result in first destroying the pragmatism of the Paris Agreement and simply benefiting China. And on one hand, assertive and coercive actions by China recently are the big threat for Japan. But on the other hand, Japan's green policies, in particular, in recent years, in many ways, are simply resulting in increasing import of Chinese solar panels. And this is the reason why I have written the paper Eco-Fundamentalism as a Grist for China's Mills, as introduced by Harry. In short, I feel that China is capitalizing on the eco-fundamentalism for their benefit by manipulating NGOs, as pointed out by Patricia. And drastic emission reductions pledges are announced by the Western countries at the time of the UN, at the time of the Climate Action Summit hosted by the administration. But these pledges are irrelevant without corresponding reductions in the Asian or emerging developing world. And despite strong push from the US to raise their target, the China or India or Russia did not toe the line with developed countries for reducing their emission reduction target. And China has declared that its emission will rise until 2030, and with incremental emissions in the period from 2020 to 2025, exceeding the total emissions of Japan. And India's emissions will also rise beyond 2030. By the way, I have a news. China submitted its new NDC today to the UN Secretariat. And according to that, it aims to have CO2 emissions to peak out before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. And to lower CO2 emission per unit of GDP, so-called CO2 intensity, by over 65% from the 2005 level. They slightly increased the speed of the reduction of the CO2 intensity from 60 to 65% to over 65%. But in short, China simply said before 2030 and before 2060, instead of by 2030 and by 2060. Not a big deal at all, to my mind. In any case, the 45% reduction in global emissions by 2030, which is required to limit temperature target or to 1.5 degrees, is almost near zero probability of being achieved. And I sense that sticking to 1.5 degrees target and also global carbon neutrality by 2050 is the failure. And this failure in climate diplomacy can be attributed to neglect of the energy requirement of developing countries, in particular in the Asian region, and which are the epicenter of incremental energy demand and CO2 emissions. And according to the polling of the United Nations, shows that while citizens in developed world, in particular Sweden, put a very high priority on tackling climate change as #1 priority, but those in developing world are placed, say, such SDGs as health and well-being, or decent work, and economic growth, and quality education in the top 3 ranks, with climate actions much lower places. And by the way, in China, the climate actions receive 15th priority out of 17 SDGs. And in Indonesia, the climate action receives 9th priority out of 17. And even in developed world, willingness to pay is severely limited, as was witnessed at the Yellow Vest movement in France. And it is far lower than expenditure required to deliver the 1.5 degree target or carbon neutrality by 2050. For example, 70% of Americans are opposed to additional cost burden of $120 per year for tackling climate change, while the IEA calls for $1,200 per year under their net zero emission 2050 scenarios. And currently, amid energy crisis, UK is obliged to operate old coal power plant to fulfill the shortage of power supply, despite its harsh attack against coal. And the US is, encouraging and demanding OPEC to produce more, while they have prohibited the pipelines or prohibited shale oil production in the federal land. So these examples reveal that security of energy supply with affordable cost take precedence over climate action, even in developed countries. The pragmatism of the Paris Agreement is being threatened by the inflexible fundamentalism of the emerging net zero target agenda put forward by the US and EU, and puts the developed and developing countries on a collision course, to my mind. And China is a sole beneficiary of these failing climate policies and failing climate diplomacy and international discord that create by this fundamentalism, to my mind. By setting a carbon neutrality target for 2060, 10 years after that of other developed countries, China has secured room for maneuver. And as soon as the failure of the net zero policies become evident, China will, say, criticize the West, developed countries, and prevaricate its own decarbonization target. As pointed out by David, Chinese companies are the principal beneficiaries of the green agenda in developed countries, holding 70% of the global solar market and representing 7 out of 10 largest wind turbine manufacturers. In fact, 80% of the solar panel installed in Japan since 2012 came from China. Japan has recently raised the emission reduction target from 26% reduction to 46% reduction by 2030. And the bulk of this increase will be fulfilled with more import of Chinese panels. It is preposterous to my mind. The trend towards electric vehicles pushed forward by Boris Johnson is a particularly advantageous development for China, sweeping away the decades of accumulated technological advantages in internal combustion engines of its major international competitors, such as Japan, Germany, and US, and providing a shortcut to automobile power status, as, say, suggested by Xi Jinping's Manufacturing Industry 2025. And dependence on Middle Eastern oil has long been the cause of concern about global energy security, but a shift towards renewables, battery storages, and EVs could also cause a different risk, namely growing dependence on China for fundamental strategic minerals and the high, say, value components manufactured from them. Low carbon policies in the West will reduce the cost of fossil fuels to China, and while at the same time increasing energy cost in the West in itself, and delivering competitive advantage to China. And yes, carbon border adjustment measures are under discussion in the EU, but to my mind, it would be powerless to prevent this free riding, since its scope is very much limited. And also, such country as Germany is fearful of, say, taking hostile trade policies against China, the big market for German export. The West's decision to create the cease funding, the coal power plant in developing world, ignores the reality of the developing countries' requirement and gives China the opportunity to expand its influence by offering the practical assistance that developed countries deny them. Yes, in September, Xi Jinping announced that it will no longer build new coal power plants in overseas. But there are already many coal power projects already agreed in the pipeline under BRI. And China's plans for regional and then a world electricity power grid raises security concerns around cybersecurity and also politically or militarily motivated disconnections. So, and the divided and acrimonious world that is being created by the net zero policies and net zero fundamentalism will permit China to further enhance its global economic presence and influence while the maneuvering, while the developed and democratic world becomes economically, say, politically and militarily weaker. Finally, I strongly buy the argument by Patricia about, the useful idiot, namely environmental NGOs. And Japan is a regular member, which is receiving a Fossil of the Day award during the COP negotiation. In COP25, Japan received Fossil of the Day award 2 times because of its dependence on coal power plant. But and even though Japan has raised its target from 26% to 46%, we are very much likely to receive Fossil of the Day award again in Glasgow, since we will still count on coal about 19% of the total power generation in 2030. But at the same time, NGOs will never, has never, and will never give a Fossil of the Day award to China, despite its enormous amount of coal power plant and its, say, enormous amount of, say, financing to overseas coal power plants. So that reveals NGOs using a complete double standard. So I have a strong suspicion that environmental NGOs are under the strong influence of Chinese government. So I tend to agree with the argument by Patricia that China is using NGOs for, say, promoting their agenda. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Arima. I should have mentioned in my introduction that Professor Arima has recently produced a report for the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is Eco-Fundamentalism as Grist for China's Mill. So please do read that if you get a chance. I think we should press on straight ahead with questions. I've been following the chat as well throughout this evening, and actually one theme that's coming through quite strongly from there is that perhaps we should question slightly this notion of sort of China with a sort of nefarious perhaps objectives, and it's actually acting very rationally in its national interest, and it's therefore predictable in the way that it will actually put its national interests first, and maybe other countries should behave the same. In the past they always have done, and that's created a basis of common understanding, and actually a sort of ideological environmentalism is now subverting that sort of common basis for diplomatic relations that has been in place before. Professor Prins, would you like to come in?
Well, yes, can I just make two points which really underline that? And I think it's something that's come through in what all 4 of us have said, particularly perhaps me and Patricia. And very bluntly, first one is China is not 10 feet tall. We're looking at a power elite around Xi Jinping that has taken an enormous gamble, looked at in the historical context of Chinese rulers. Having taken that gamble, they are using traditional techniques. So there is, as Harry has just indicated, and I think questioners who have been, or commentators who've been making this point are right, I think that it's easy for those of us in the West who are not sinologists, but who are interested in China, to persuade ourselves that they are a great mystery. I think it can be overstated. I don't think there's anything particularly mysterious about the pursuit of geopolitical objectives by the Chinese elite. Nor do I think we should forget that there is something quite precarious within the Chinese Communist Party, the Politburo that surrounds Xi Jinping. He is not without critics. And if he stumbles in any of a number of areas, then he could disappear as quickly as any emperors have done on previous occasions. Now, from our own point of view, I think that all of us have said pretty much the same thing, which is wake up. Be aware that we are dealing with rational actors here. Study them, understand that, and this is why I referred in my remarks, and indeed do at some length in The Worm in the Rose, to the historic texts which have guided Chinese leaders over centuries. One of the other of the famous 36 maxims from the 5th century BC says, pillage a burning house. So if you have an enemy that is distressed, as we in the West are, particularly in this pandemic year, or these pandemic years as they have now become, then use those opportunities to your advantage. That's a perfectly clear and rational, if very cynical, approach, but it's clearly one that they're pursuing. I just want to make one final point and then hand over to colleagues. A lot of my work is in a much more traditional area of geopolitics and strategy, so I'm well familiar with the military confrontations that are taking place in the South China Sea and with the way in which China has been blustering. And I think our Japanese colleagues, for very good geographical reasons, are acutely aware of these movements. I would simply say this. In the course of this last few months, those in the Politburo who might have been critical of Xi Jinping's aggressive posture, which, as I've pointed out several times, is eccentric in history, may feel themselves to be well justified if they look at what our reaction has been. We do have a tendency in the West to run ourselves down. We have, because it's the nature of democracies, sometimes rather weird people who are elected to high office. But what is often called the deep state operates usually very smoothly. And it has been doing so in Professor Arima's backyard, as he will know well. In the last few months, we have had 5 Western naval battle groups in the South China Sea. We've had 1 British one, we've had 2 American fleets, we have had 1 de facto Japanese battle fleet, and we have had the Royal Australian Navy. We've had well over half a dozen advanced hunter-killer nuclear submarines, an area where the Chinese are particularly weak in their submarine detection. In other words, if this is a game of deterrence, which it is, we are not without weapons. But where we are weak, as Patricia has pointed out eloquently in her Useful Fools article, and I think all of us in our different writings have made this point, we are weak in the gullibility of those who, in our own societies, and I include the academic world, I'm sorry to say, as being prominent in this, who have been open to blandishments of the United Front Work Department, which has assiduously courted expertise among Westerners by bribery and by flattery, and through things like the 1,000 Talent Program, has implanted Chinese researchers There is an extremely worrying paper by one of our colleagues here in Britain, Dr. Radomir Teilkut, which details just how deeply in our defense research capacities we have allowed Chinese mainland scientists to penetrate. We have had Chinese defense scientists working inside the Diamond Light facility at Harwell, which is where we actually design our nuclear weapons warheads. You know, this is extraordinarily lax and unwise behavior that must stop, and I believe will stop.
Thank you, Gwythian. David, perhaps we could come to you next, and I might just add the supplementary question, which is one thing that sort of strikes me listening to Chinese diplomats, is actually just how rude sometimes they can be about the countries in which they are based. And it's striking that you have these so-called diplomats who use such uncompromising language and yet are not met with that much pushback from their host country. So perhaps there's a sort of little dynamic there that needs to be explored. David.
Well, I'd like to pick up on a point that Gwythian made just then. He talked about China as rational actors. And of course, that's right. The problem, I think, is that right now, Western leaders are not rational. Right. They are behaving with complete irrationality. They are behaving in a way which is performative, which is, to use that common cliche, virtue signaling. And when presented with the evidence that this is so, especially in this field of climate and energy policy, they simply refuse to listen. And they go along with the narrative that is peddled by green fundamentalists, that anybody who questions any aspect of the policy that they are pursuing must be a climate change denier and is willing to sacrifice the future of their children or their grandchildren. Now, as a journalist, it grieves me deeply to point out that the media are their willing accomplices in this irrationality. And I see from some of the chat that a lot of people have drawn attention to this. There is no longer any pretense at investigation, balance, or free inquiry across huge swathes of the Western media when it comes to the questions both of China and energy and climate. We saw how for many months after the start of the pandemic, it was regarded as a nutso conspiracy theory, even to suggest that coronavirus might have leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Slowly but surely, the weight of evidence has begun to force a reassessment of that. But at the same time, you know, inquiry and investigation into climate and energy is completely absent. So one of the people I've seen in the chat has talked about the lunacy of RCP 8.5, the high emissions scenario, which has had such an impact on papers by various academics projecting imminent doom and gloom on many fronts. The sixth assessment of the IPCC panel produced last summer finally admitted that RCP 8.5 was not a business as usual scenario, but an extreme scenario, which is really, there is no possibility that it will come to pass. It posits a 50% increase in the total world population by 2100 to 12 billion that most demographers now think is out of the question, with global population likely to peak in the 2040s. It posits a tenfold increase in the use of coal, which is clearly out of the question. We are on a far lower emissions trajectory, and yet still this torrent of papers positing 8.5 as the business as usual scenario continues to emerge and is constantly emphasized by the global media. Roger Pielke Jr., the scientist at the University of Colorado at Boulder, has repeatedly drawn attention to this. And for this, he has been vilified. He has been subjected to congressional investigation. He's almost had his career wrecked. That is the degree of irrationality with which we are now dealing. Now, you could say we deal with irrationality in other spheres too. I know, I'm sure you all know what areas that I'm referring to, but there's no need to go there. I think this is our chief challenge now, is somehow to restore rationality to debate. The final point I make is, again, some of the people in the chat have drawn attention to the fact that it's not just the Conservative Party leadership which completely goes along with this and refuses to engage on a rational level. It's all parties in the UK. And indeed, there's no prospect of that changing anytime soon, although the formation of the net zero group and the people involved with that is clearly a positive sign. It is finally starting to achieve some traction and to subject policies to scrutiny. But I do find it very interesting, this emerging demand for a referendum. And I just wonder if that might become the rallying point for some sort of proper, rational challenge to what we're doing. And it's not just the goal of reaching net zero, it is the way we're doing it. It is, you know, the magical thinking which dominates so many Western leaders. Oh, there's a problem with wind energy because it's intermittent. Oh, well, we'll quadruple the amount of offshore wind. That'll sort it out. No, it won't, and so on. So that's the overarching challenge. How do we get back to rational policy making, and of course rational debate, which right now is almost impossible.
Thank you. Patricia, if we might come to you next, and maybe I could add the question of why do we see that naivety in Western governments that doesn't mirror the sort of strategic rationality that we see from China? What's got us into such a perilous state?
I think there are two sort of positions in a country like Canada, for example, and I imagine in all Western countries, between those who make money by either investing in China or exporting to China or importing goods from China. It's a big market. They want to get into the country. I understand that. But what happened in Canada was very interesting after the two Michaels were arrested. So when the US issued the indictment for Meng Wanzhou, she traveled through Vancouver airport. The Canadian authorities picked her up, arrested her, and she has just gone home, as you probably know, after admitting to having broken the law and getting a deferred prosecution agreement. Almost instantly, public opinion in Canada about China dropped like a stone. The public got it. They understood what this government was all about. The Canadian government didn't get it. They took a long time. There were academics, there were business people signing petition letters saying, let Meng Wanzhou go, bring the two Michaels home. But the public got it. The public said, absolutely not, follow the rule of law. She has her day in court, she's been receiving due process, just proceed and do not intervene politically. So I would agree with the point that the viewers have made that China's acting rationally when it comes to energy. If only our governments would act in the same way. I mean, they are acting rationally. What puzzles me is that Xi Jinping has taken the gloves off. He's unleashed the wolf warriors in the diplomatic arena. They are extremely offensive. And all that they have done is confirm to the public around the world that this is a government that is a raiding government, is not a trading government. They don't follow the rules. They steal, they lie, they cheat, they kidnap. It's very, very difficult to have a normal trading and diplomatic relationship with this government. And I think that you were right, Win, that it has that Xi Jinping has overplayed his hand. Why he's overplayed his hand, I puzzle over. I can only think that internally, he's benefiting by demonizing foreigners. There's a lot of young people in the country who are rootless. They don't believe in the Communist Party anymore, but they are extremely nationalistic. And they respond well to his demonization of all of Western countries. We were in China in 2005, watched the Chinese TV media. And in that particular year, I forget what the event was, but the Chinese Communist Party was going after Japan. just one program after another demonizing how dreadful the Japanese were. So they do this in order to build themselves up. They go after foreigners, and you can see this in Global Times, the mouthpiece for the Communist Party. I mean, I in a way love reading the Global Times because it is often so ridiculous, and you also get to see what their thinking is. You can see the kind of arguments that they're going to make. But I think that they are actually being quite rational on energy, and we are not. We are being crazy. We are caught in the grips of a mania, and our governments are doing absolutely dreadful things to our economies.
Thank you. And Professor Arima, I'd like to ask you what we should make of a couple of statements of the Chinese government recently. Firstly, the fact that Xi Jinping is not, it seems, going to be attending COP26 in person. What's meant by that? And also there's this new pledge not to build coal power stations in developing countries. Are they going to abide by this? If China doesn't build these power stations, who will? And actually, what impact will this have on the developing world if those countries can't have access to cheap, reliable forms of energy?
Well, good question. And we don't know the detail of his announcement. He simply said China will not build coal-fired power plant in overseas, period. And its detailed interpretation is still remains to be seen. But as I said, China has already agreed many coal power projects to be built in countries under the Belt and Road initiatives. And whether China will cancel all the projects, including under construction, I doubt it. So therefore, anyway, there will be many new coal power plants to be built by China, even though they will not get into a new negotiation of the new project. So that is my first point. And then, his announcement not to build coal power plant anymore in overseas may not be a big sacrifice for China because, in developing countries, also under the pressure from the Paris Agreement, there is a tendency to switch from coal to natural gas in such countries as ASEAN. And also, they will consider introducing more renewables. Then China will export their solar panels and batteries to those countries. So they simply switch the export item from coal power plants to solar power. In any way, China will not lose. So they are doing very much smart, trading policies. So but in such country as India, they still also need coal power plants. And I asked, my Indian friends, if China stopped financing coal in overseas, and anyway, China and India has, very much, the sensitive diplomatic relation. So India will not consider counting on China's support, and India might have considered finance from Asian Development Bank, but ADB is not financing coal power plant anymore. So India will simply mobilize their local finance, and they also have their own local technologies. So even without China's support, the countries which needs coal power plants can still build coal power plants, even though the increase of the coal power plants may not be as steep as in the past 10 years, but they will still need coal power. So it is completely crazy to demand them to phase out coal in 10 years or 15 years or something, because the vintage of the coal power plants in developing countries are very young, less than 10 years or something. So which countries will dare to stop operating coal power plant for the sake of climate change? And affordability is the #1 priority for many developing countries. And the affordability also matters in US and also European countries. So that is why UK reoperated coal power plant despite its, say, hostile posture towards coal. So I think, there is a deep, how can I say, discrepancy between, say, advocacy on climate change and actual actions by the government. So if government faces the severe reality that people are running short of, say, energy, or if energy price is skyrocketing, then they will abandon the climate claim and they will switch to fossil fuels. That is the energy reality. And we should face this reality.
Thank you. We're already over the runtime that we were initially going to go with. And I'm sure we can continue on and on these vitally important issues. I think we probably can go about 10 minutes over if the panelists are happy with that, because there's so much to discuss. But we will just go to some final round of questions and then quick final statements. So if you could keep your answers to the next questions just to a couple of sentences, because we are running out of time, but I'm sure you will be concise and as articulate as ever. So I think two really important ones to finish on, and we'll go to each panelist in turn. Firstly, what are our predictions for COP? And secondly, the current energy price crisis. We've seen gas prices move very high. We heard from Patricia earlier about how these high prices actually expose a weakness in terms of China's access to fossil fuels. So what do we make of the dynamics of COP in the context of the current energy price crisis? So,
to go in reverse order?
Reverse order.
Why don't we go to Professor Arima first?
Well, it is a very difficult question, but whoever the host country of COP, they will claim in the end the conference was success.
Of course.
So Boris Johnson is saying that I emphasize the coal, cars, cash, and forest, and perhaps he will feel it very much difficult to persuade all the countries to phase out coal. But he might get some cash from certain countries, and he might get some, the coalition of the willing for phasing out of coal, even though he cannot say force all the countries to phase out coal. So with that, he will claim that it's success. So, but I think the outcome of the COP26 will be very mixed compared with his initial very much ambitious agendas. Finish.
I would also imagine that everybody will claim success. If they don't, then it's the end of the campaign. And if China doesn't participate and China doesn't do something that gives those, really the climate change industry, if you want to call them that includes the NGOs, but there are a lot of businesses who now depend on climate change being a real problem and net zero being a goal. So they will need to extract some sort of success out of this meeting. And I imagine they will declare success. Meanwhile, I think China will carry on business as usual. They will manage the prices. They have complete control over their economy. The current crisis at the moment is in part the result of having given directives to reduce CO2, but it's largely just central planning mismanagement. They lurch from one energy policy to another, and that's true of the rest of the economy. And so they get into trouble, but they always find some sort of corrective measure. So I think for China, business as usual. CO2 levels will go up. They have to go up. It's the basis of their strength of the regime. And they will declare success, and I'm sure the useful idiots will declare success, and the industry that depends on climate change will also, and the governments as well.
Thank you, David.
Well, I actually feel very sorry for the COP delegates, because they're heading off to Glasgow at a time of year when the weather is rarely pleasant. A city which is facing a complete shutdown of its public transport services, where there is also a refuse collection strike, and there are apparently large rats being somewhat menacing in the streets. On top of that, Glasgow is a city which did very well in the 80s and 90s, but since has sadly fallen into considerable decay. So it's not going to be much fun. And so I think these delegates are going to start getting quite grumpy. And as they're locked up there day after day, night after night, with the inevitable, all-night sessions to try to get some sort of agreement, they're going to be, really quite tetchy. It's going to be a wretched experience for all of them. I'm sure they will declare victory, because they always do, with the exception, I suppose, of Copenhagen in 2009. But I think it is going to be a very thin victory, and it's a victory which will very rapidly unravel, because it will be seen by the world's media to be a meaningless victory, which, as Patricia says, will actually do very little or nothing to stop China's autonomous rise. Just to answer the other question that you posed, what do I think will happen with the current crisis? I have been sure for a long time that we are heading for a massive energy crunch. And I always imagined it was some way off. I thought that, you know, the internal contradictions that are inherent in the current direction of policy in Britain and elsewhere would eventually cause it to collapse. I think they're getting much closer to that. I mean, we've seen from the UK budget yesterday that, you know, public finances are actually in quite a fragile state. They're very vulnerable to rises in interest rates, which seem almost inevitable with the scale of borrowing. And we're already, without factoring in further energy price rises, looking at declining standards of living. And we've talked about, you know, how the Chinese people will feel very disgruntled in their leadership, given the hardships that they might have to endure. Well, you know, the same is going to be true of Britain's. So I think we are in for a potentially very interesting time, to use a Chinese phrase. I think there's no sign that the energy price crunch is going to end anytime soon. And if it subsides just a little bit, it will come back with a vengeance. More interestingly, I do think that as the pressure on the grid becomes ever greater, and the lack of baseload capacity more intense, there is a real possibility of blackouts in the UK. And of course, having a blackout now will be a much nastier experience than it was in the 1970s, which I can remember from my childhood, when we had the 3-day week. Then we had, you know, in my house, we had a coal-fed central heating system, which didn't need a pump. It was gravity-fed from a tank in the attic. So we kept warm even when the electricity wasn't working, and it was all, you know, a bit of a lot. We had baths by candlelight and hot baths by candlelight. It's going to be very different now. People absolutely reliant on electronic devices of all kinds will not be able to use them or charge them. Their heating systems will immediately stop functioning, because they're entirely dependent on pumps and electronics, even if they're gas-fired boilers rather than air source heat pumps. So I think it could be a very rocky winter. Potentially, we might get through it, but we might not if there is a large La Nina, which appears to be building. But, you know, overall, looking into the medium term, I do think, you know, ultimately there are objective realities here, and people might have magical thinking about these issues now, but there will be nothing like really high inflation, stagflation, and potentially blackouts to focus people's minds.
Thank you. And finally to...
well, thank you. Picking up directly from what David said, and also, Patricia, to answer the rhetorical question that you left hanging, what is going to bring a change in Western politicians who are currently locked into the extraordinary narrative? The answer we have just described. There is going to be a crash, a nasty energy crash. We have had a small example of it already with the failure of the Energiewende in Germany. And we know that even though the industrial sectors were given special protection, it required, in the end, the construction of new coal-fired plant using actually very dirty lignite coal in East Germany. So when push comes to shove, politicians do value their own survival. But yes, so a crash is highly likely. I think David is completely right. There is an excellent GWPF paper, by the way, which you may all have seen, and if you haven't, I strongly recommend it, by Andrew Montford, which deals with the apparently very obscure topic of local area wiring. But it's absolutely vital, because the local area wiring that has been installed was never installed with the intention of people plugging in 7 kVA electric vehicles to charge overnight while simultaneously running heat pumps. The fuses will simply blow, or the wires will melt. Or you have to dig up every street in England to relay the electrical grid. So this is indeed magical thinking. To take David's question straight back home, I will give you a personal answer. At home, living in the deep countryside, in the West Country where I do, on my little farm, I have a 4x4 case international tractor who we call Beatrice. And Beatrice is acquiring next week a 20 kVA continuously related power takeoff driven generator, which will keep all of our systems in our various, in the main house and the outbuildings, will keep us running through the winter, because we are planning on the collapse of the grid. And is that not a humiliating thing to say in a country which until only 10 years ago had one of the strongest grids in any industrial country, a grid which operated right the way through 2 world wars? What will happen in Glasgow, going back to what Jun said, yes, of course, it will be the usual pattern, Jun, that we have observed so many times. We will go into the all-night sittings, we will have breakthrough moments, we will have a declaration of success, whatever that may be. It is, as Einstein says, the definition of madness to do the same thing over and over again, expecting that you're going to get a different result. But if I may end on a positive note, because it's where I was invited to come in fact, by our chairman, one of the things I've done in The Worm in the Rose is to end up offering the Golden Bridge, which is available to Western leaders if they're prepared to walk across it. And Boris Johnson being a chancellor, he might just want to do that. And we all know what this bridge is. It is a thermodynamically competent energy transition to clean energy. And what does that mean? It means gas leading to high temperature, small modular nuclear reactors, not large system reactors. In this, it happens that Japan is in the technological lead. And that matters a great deal because the lead technology here, Jun made the point that we are almost unthinkingly giving over a century's worth of technological lead in internal combustion engines to the Chinese for no purpose whatsoever. But we do have the technological lead in high temperature small nuclear reactors. The Japanese test reactor has been running now very successfully and was in fact licensed, if I am correct, Jun, in July for full-scale operation. And this is capable of many things, not only process heat and electricity, but it also produces enough positive EROEI, in other words, energy return on energy invested, process heat to be able to think about industrial levels of hydrogen production, things which you cannot do by any of these so-called green and blue methodologies. So there is a bridge, and it's a technologically achievable bridge, but it involves admitting mistake. And that is one of the things, of course, which politicians find it extremely hard to do. As for those who are religiously invested in this matter, for them, I'm afraid I can offer no hope, except that they will eventually find redemption. And meanwhile, as we started at the beginning of this very interesting webinar, they will presumably continue to stick their faces to the M25 motorway and make me infuriated when I have to drive home at the end of this webinar.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Gwythian. I think that's an excellent point to end on, and I think everyone's comments just then will probably serve very well as their closing statements, because we are very much over time. So we are unfortunately going to have to close it there. We've had so many insightful remarks from our panelists this evening. So my thanks personally to them and from Net Zero Watch to our excellent panelists who have facilitated a brilliant discussion. Please go away, and if you haven't already, read those papers which I referred to and read David's excellent journalism on this topic, which you can find on the Daily Mail website, because it's such an important topic. And as COP approaches, it's a really important issue that we need to get people's attention on the threat from China, the threat that we are sort of sacrificing our own competitiveness to China's advantage. So thank you everyone for participating wherever you are in the world. We've had people from all over join us this evening, so we're so grateful to all of you for joining us. And we hope to see you again at one of our events in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.